like climate change. Over the past year, we have all faced unprecedented challenges: a global pandemic punctuated by racial justice reckoning, an economic downturn, spikes in crime, and a once in a lifetime election. No one escaped 2020 unscathed, and for that reason, many have called COVID 19 the great equalizer. But I don't believe that is true at all. In fact, COVID has only exacerbated the vast inequities that exist within our society, inequities that are further inflamed by climate crisis that disproportionately affects our most vulnerable communities. So as we make the much needed turn toward recovery and we think about what it means to build back better, we can't ignore the role that climate justice must play in our plans for the future. This committee understands better than anyone how complex these issues truly are. Almost every challenge we face in the mayor's office, whether it's infrastructure challenges, unemployment, affordable housing, or transportation, can be connected to climate change, which is why the solution must be intersectional and must be as intersectional as the problem. When I became mayor of Atlanta, I set forth my vision for One Atlanta, a more affordable, resilient, and equitable city for all. Central to that vision are collaborative, bold, innovative ideas that address climate change, create economic opportunity, and confront injustice head on. That is why we are committed to 100% clean energy by 2035 and sustainable food access to as many residents as possible. We also established a community-led clean energy advisory board and joined the American Cities Climate Challenge. Work like this requires targeted investments in American cities to build out our nation's sustainable infrastructure, to create well-paying jobs, and to support a resilient, clean energy future. In many infrastructure and economic recovery, in any infrastructure and economic recovery package, we also urge you to prioritize and expand programs where funds flow directly to cities from the federal government, prioritize local government-led processes for federal funds that flow to the states to improve inclusivity and accountability, ensure that federal programs and funding prioritize disadvantaged communities and allow sufficient administrative and implementation flexibility to meet local needs, ensure that federal spending is accompanied by workforce standards that prioritize job quality and equitable access to well-paying, high-road careers. Cities face specific challenges unique to their geographical areas and therefore require flexible funding, direct grants, block grants, et cetera, that allow cities to address their distinct challenges efficiently and innovatively while remaining accountable to grant requirements. While I sit here today in my capacity as mayor of Atlanta, first and foremost, I am a mother of 4 children with asthma. Just 2 weeks ago, I sat in the doctor's office with my son who has mild chronic asthma, as the doctor shared with me that the entire week his office had been flooded with children because the air quality was so poor just 2 weeks ago in Atlanta. So I know firsthand how climate change can affect real people in their everyday lives. We are dealing with it in my household. This is not an esoteric problem that we face as elected officials. It's a real world crisis that has already hit home for people around the world. Passage of the American Jobs Plan, including direct support to cities, will build a more equitable and resilient country, and your action will save lives. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor. Next, Ms. Wallace, you are recognized for 5 minutes for a presentation of your testimony. Welcome.
Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee, I appreciate today's opportunity to underscore the value of investing in both the economic vitality and ecological integrity of the Mississippi River. The governors of Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, and Wisconsin formed UMRBA to foster and facilitate interstate water resources planning and cooperative action. UMRBA's premise for its ongoing work to enhance ecological and economic resilience to climate change is that regional science, collaboration, and planning will lead us towards regional resilience. We know that water, the amount flowing through the river, the duration it remains high or low, the rate of change between high levels and low levels greatly influences the river's resilience. Science is a fundamental priority. We have over 30 years of continuous monitoring through the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program that allows us to quantify the ecosystem's resilience. In other words, its capacity to absorb disturbances and sustain its fundamental characteristics. Continuing this monitoring will allow us to make scientific observations about how the climate is affecting the river ecosystem and how species might use the Mississippi River's longitudinal orientation to adjust their respective ranges to their advantage. There is a tremendous amount of information at our disposal and ongoing and planned efforts to increase our knowledge of climate change risks, including our forecasting capabilities. Our goal is to integrate the natural and social sciences to evaluate the effectiveness of potential actions while considering the social, economic, and ecological dimensions of the problems and opportunities. This includes developing detailed assessments of the river's current and future needs for flood conveyance and storage, and the unique causes of drought onset, magnitude, and duration in the watershed. Major river systems like the Mississippi River require a sense of unity and shared commitment to solutions. Unity requires an appreciation of neighbors and conflicting interests and common knowledge of the resources, the problems, and opportunities. It also requires us having a shared vision for the future and a plan to achieve that future. While local planning is incredibly important to the unique characteristics and resources of each individual community, the interconnectedness among stakeholders across the watershed calls for regional planning. Achieving resilience will reside in our ability to work together. The discourse will be contentious at times. The issues are personal and involve people's families, homes, and livelihoods. But as indicative of the past, collective planning that considers individual, community, and regional implications will lead to solutions that are carried forward for decades and have lasting benefits. Today, I would like to discuss a robust solutions for adapting to and mitigating the effects of climate change. The Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program restores the river's natural mosaic of braided channels and backwaters, increasing the quantity, quality, and diversity of habitat available for a wide range of fish and wildlife. The Navigation and Ecosystem Sustainability Program is a comprehensive and integrated plan for meeting current and future shipping demands by modernizing the lock system and improving the health and resilience of the river ecosystem. We respectfully request continued support for these two programs with a new construction start for the Navigation and Ecosystem Sustainability Program. The health, function, and viability of the main stem Mississippi River reflects the performance of the watershed as a whole. It is widely acknowledged that actions must be taken in the watershed. While important strides in conservation practices and point and non-point source loading reductions have been achieved, attaining the goals we have collectively set through the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan will require acceleration of its implementation. We respectfully request an increase in federal support for the ongoing implementation of the state's nutrient reduction strategies, including improving utilization of existing programs while dedicating resources specific to fulfilling that action plan. And finally, as the Governor's Joint Interstate Collaborative, UMRBA is serving as the convening entity for collective action to build the resilience of the Upper Mississippi River to major flood events, prolonged drought, and excessive sediment through a unified suite of strategies and actions that would be implemented through a broad range of stakeholder authorities. UMRBA applauds this committee's focus on creating a national dialogue around climate change and on finding and investing in sound solutions. We believe that the science, collaboration, and planning on the Upper Mississippi River can serve as a model for other regions of the country and other floodplain systems across the world. We would appreciate an opportunity to continue working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace, and thanks to all of our witnesses for your insightful and informative testimony. Next, we're going to go to member questions. I'm going to start and yield my time to Representative Escobar of Texas. Rep. Escobar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and many thanks to our panelists. I know that we are all in this struggle together. I represent El Paso, Texas, and I'm coming to you from the safe and secure US-Mexico border community that is in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert, a community that is dealing with also with issues around drought, extreme heat. I mean, we are seeing more and more days with temperatures well above 100. I mean, just yesterday, this week, we're at 108. We are rapidly becoming as hot as communities like Phoenix and Tucson that have dealt with extreme heat for long periods of time. But it's and we're dealing also with a shrinking amounts of water in the Rio Grande. So I know we're all in this really catastrophic struggle together. Mayor Garcetti, sorry, when I say mayor, there's three of you who will not. Mayor Garcetti, I've been looking into a lot of the work that Los Angeles has done specifically on solar. And you all heard about what happened in Texas with the grid. El Paso actually is on the Western grid. So we were exempt from the terrible consequences of what happened with the grid in the rest of Texas. But we have a utility, El Paso Electric, is about to build or is seeking to build a new power plant that is going to be utilizing natural gas. And many in the community have been pushing on the utility to go solar, to instead of creating what could be at some point a stranded asset. And that's how Secretary John Kerry has deemed some of these as stranded assets in the future. Many are calling on them to just move towards solar far more quickly. And what we hear back is that the challenge is storage, and that the technology and capacity is still not there. I would love to hear about what you did, what's happening in Los Angeles, and how you charted that path.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Escobar. My grandfather crossed that Chihuahuan Desert through El Paso as a baby in my bisabuela's arms to come to this country. So it's wonderful to have the Chihuahuan Desert evoked. So, we are the #1 solar city in America. And you're right, it is a more complicated power source. And we've kind of taken a threefold approach. One is massive solar arrays in the high desert north of LA. The biggest and cheapest in the country with storage is under construction right now, the Eland Solar Project, and it's cheaper than a new gas plant. So on the cost, it's actually quite effective. Second, we have a feed-in tariff that allows huge warehouses and other buildings to basically become power plants for us, and our utility pays them. And third, distributed solar, which is at the neighborhood level, in which you have it on households, including low-income households, and looking increasingly at storage and building out the grid that it can accommodate much more generation there. When we had recent wildfires, Los Angeles City never had any outages because of that, but it came close because it cut off power lines that come in from other states, and we came within 1% or 2% of needing to have some blackouts in order to manage our electricity. So I would say this, one of the ways you can look at solar is, yes, battery storage, but that gets you only through a day or two. It's not long term. We're also looking at excess wind and solar through some of the lines that come in from Utah, and looking for green hydrogen. We put out an RFI to store green hydrogen, but to create that using the excess solar. Under our biggest power plant in Utah, which we have the biggest ownership of, there are salt caverns the size of Empire State Buildings, about 7 of them. And we're looking at firing up our turbines with a combination of natural gas and hydrogen, trying to get all the way to hydrogen. So it's a way to store the solar production and the wind production in something that if you need, for instance, after an earthquake in our city, weeks of power, that would be much more dependable. So it's a combination of different types of solar, different types of storage, and looking at excess solar and putting that in a usable fuel as well.
Thank you so much, Mayor Garcetti. And Chairwoman Castor, thank you so much for yielding to me and your time. Appreciate it. I yield back.
Terrific. Next, Representative Graves, do I understand you're yielding to Rep. Palmer?
Yes, going to defer to Palmer to go first. Yeah.
Okay. Representative Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for deferring to me. It would have been helpful if you told me ahead of time, but we'll discuss that internally next time. I am very glad that we're having this discussion about dealing with mega drought, and I saw Chairman Castor smile at that reference to Garrett Graves. I think it's time that we look at the efforts that we need to be making in terms of resilience, because as I've tried to point out on this committee many times, climate has a history. California, for instance, has a history of mega droughts. There have been at least 4 mega droughts over the last 1,200 years that have had enormously severe impacts. The one that California is in right now has a serious impact. And what I'd like to ask Mayor Garcetti is, looking at California, the state of California's water policies and their failure to prepare adequately for the drought that you're in right now, should be of great concern to all of the mayors in California. You had a major wet period in 2019, record amounts of snowfall. I think the snowpack was 153%. Yet because of the failure to prepare for the wet periods, you're really struggling in terms of your water capacity. How would you respond to that?
Sure. A couple things. One is it doesn't resonate as much in the city of Los Angeles because we've been preparing for a long time, and it's not a switch you can just flip right away. We built out, for instance, a ton of stormwater capture so that when that snow melted, eventually made its way down into Los Angeles River and other places, we now have huge catch basins. I passed the largest water bond at the local level in U.S. history as a council member that put $500 million into being able to really reinfiltrate that water into our natural aquifers. As I mentioned too, we're taking something that's 3 times bigger than the LA aqueduct by taking our wastewater plant, where 60% of our water flows through, gets cleaned up, and then washed out to the ocean, the only place that doesn't need more water. And we're converting that into something that will give us enough water for decades to come. But I hear the point of what you're saying, and I do believe that both local, state, and federal government should be investing in that infrastructure, whether it's the WIFIA funds that are out there or other things of the longer term retention.
I want to ask some other questions of other members, but okay. I do appreciate that point you just made, that we do need to be investing in this, and California should have been doing this. I don't think there's been a new reservoir built in California since 1979. It not only would give you the water storage capacity, but also help mitigate against the flooding that you guys went through a couple of years ago. Ms. Wallace, the same thing with the Mississippi basin. There were thriving Mississippian cultures throughout the Mississippi River Basin up until about maybe between 1200 and 1500, and they began to disappear largely because of prolonged drought. What we're experiencing, climate change, is not new. So in your work, how are you preparing for the climate change that's coming that we can't do anything about? Or are you taking that into account? Or have you looked at the history of climate in the region?
Yes, and we're continuing to do that, knowing what has happened in that history, but also what's likely to come in the future is driving our conversations. There's a few things that we're trying to do to prepare ourselves for the future and act now. It's as much of a science element. So we are working on our science. We're working on, a U.S. Geological Survey now has a next generation water observing system program, which intensively monitors a basin, and they're doing 10 within the country. One is on the Illinois River Basin, extending down from Chicago down to the Mississippi River, and we'll learn a lot about those systems.
Well, I just want to cut you off. I'm very happy that you're doing that. I've only got a few seconds left, and I do want to bring this up. There's something very important to me because I grew up dirt poor in rural Northwest Alabama, and I'm concerned. There's an article that was in the LA Times that Mayor Garcetti that California's clean energy programs are mainly benefiting the rich. I have grave concerns, serious concerns about energy poverty. Energy poverty in Atlanta. Atlanta has the 3rd highest rate of energy poverty in the country among U.S. major cities. Same thing's true in Los Angeles, and I'm sure you're familiar with that article. So Mayor Garcetti, I hope that in your clean energy plans, you're taking that into account, that low-income families need access to reliable energy.
No question. And since we own our own utility, we're able to do that with probably the strongest low-income assistance, because we share that, you and I together. We have different rates. We have huge subsidies. And thanks to federal action, we have utility assistance from this pandemic that we've also taken some of our coronavirus relief funds, back when we called things coronavirus, directly into low-income utility assistance. And finally, we put solar on the homes of low-income residents, because it should not be something that you just can afford to do. This has to be done for and by and with all Americans.
Mayor Bottoms.
I think we're out of time, and
Okay.
but maybe we'll be able to come back and Mayor can answer on during another member's time. Next, we'll go to Rep. Bonamici. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to our witnesses. I represent Northwest Oregon, and here in the Pacific Northwest, we know that climate change is not a distant threat. It's our reality. In fact, last summer, nearly 1 million acres burned across my home state of Oregon as a result of historic winds, dry fuel conditions. Lives were lost, towns were destroyed, and air quality surpassed hazardous levels across the state and region. In fact, I'm extremely concerned by recent outlooks from the National Interagency Fire Center that suggests that the lack of rain and snow could result in yet another horrific wildfire season. And today's infrastructure and building standards don't take future climate trends into account, and current levels of infrastructure investment are not enough to respond to the threats of the climate crisis. We can truly learn from local leadership about addressing the climate crisis while making our communities more resilient. So Mayor Garcetti, in your testimony, you noted the importance of energy efficiency upgrades in creating good paying jobs, reducing emissions, and improving air filtration for public health. So what are the current barriers for local governments in retrofitting public buildings to serve as shelters during wildfires or extreme heat events? And how can the federal government better incentivize weatherization and other programs to meet the needs of communities often devastated by wildfires?
It's a great question. I think, giving us those funds to be able to look at not just at building out greener power, but actually reducing and conserving and building that sort of resilience is critical. Again, I feel somewhat spoiled because we control our own utility. We don't have to negotiate with a private utility on this. But whether it's rebates for high efficiency air conditioning, we install insulation for folks. We do have cold weather here too sometimes, and obviously for the warm weather days. These sorts of things, which can be co-owned by the federal government or incentivized by the federal government for utilities, would go a huge way. It's usually pennies on the dollar for building out new things, and building efficiency is one of the areas we certainly have seen our energy use go dramatically down per capita in the city of Los Angeles. And I would encourage the federal government to look at what they can do in other communities to mirror that.
Thank you so much. And Mayor Rhodes Conway, in your testimony, you mentioned the challenges of harmful algal blooms and hypoxia for beach and lake access points in Madison. And I know this is an issue that is of concern across the country. We face similar challenges across freshwater and marine ecosystems in Northwest Oregon. So how can natural infrastructure investments help address runoff and improve water quality to prevent future HABs and hypoxic events?
Thank you, Representative. This is a serious issue for the city of Madison, and we are surrounded by lakes. And it is no question that our changing climate is exacerbating this problem with both more runoff and higher temperatures that make the algae grow faster. We are looking at, I mentioned the stormwater studies that we're doing. We are looking at how we can build in green infrastructure to slow that runoff, to infiltrate more water, and to clean the water that does end up in our lakes. We spend a tremendous amount of time and energy on this, whether it's managing the leaves that fall in the autumn and keeping them out of the lakes, or in helping people to build their own rain gardens in their front lawns, in the terraces. But honestly, the scale of the investment is beyond us. That's needed. And we really do need support from the federal government here. As I mentioned, in just our first 4 watershed studies, in looking at a combination of both green and gray infrastructure improvements, we're already at $75 million, which is an absolutely unprecedented level for our stormwater utility. I will take the opportunity to mention, Representative, that while I appreciate the WIFIA funding, we don't actually need more opportunity to borrow. What we need is direct grants from the federal government in order to make these investments.
And thank you so much, Mayor. And I'm going to use my remaining time to ask Mayor Lance Bottoms to please respond to the question that was raised about costs and disparities in serving your people in Atlanta.
Thank you for the question. We have tried to put equity at the center of everything that we do. And even when you look at a map of our city, what you will see is that the energy burden primarily rests with communities that are lower income communities of color. And so what's been very helpful to us in Atlanta, and even having this very complicated discussion about climate change, is to speak to our communities in ways that it makes sense and it's impacting their day-to-day lives. So if we speak of it in terms of how it impacts asthma, we have some of the highest asthma rates for children in our city. If I'm speaking with seniors like my mother, I'm speaking in terms of how much they are paying each month for their utility bills. It becomes a much easier conversation and gives us the opportunity to have broader buy-in than if we just speak of it in very complicated, hard to understand terms.
Thank you, Mayor. And I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Representative Armstrong. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through a really fortunate set of circumstances, two of my best friends in the whole world live in Atlanta. So I have had what I consider the pleasure of spending an exorbitant amount of time in that city. And it's fantastic. And I can even deal with the traffic. But I tend to wonder if some of the congestion is because everything seems to be located on Peachtree. And even my GPS gives up at certain points in times about where it's trying to go. But I also appreciate that we're doing this hearing and we're talking about community resiliency and talking about the upper Mississippi River Basin, because we're on the Missouri River Basin and not all community resiliency exists in large cities. And those of you on the committee have known that I bring this up a lot. North Dakota understands firsthand, as well as anyone, problems posed by severe weather events, whether it's droughts or flooding. And even now in our state, we've got 2/3 of our state in what is a historical drought, and the other third of our state, we got 12 inches of rain the other day. And oftentimes we just have to deal with these things. But that brings me to, the last thing, we need to finance these things, we need to fund these things. But part of the issue is, and we've experienced this, is the federal policy that dictates how to address these challenges while leaving little room for involvement at the state and the local level. We're in the process of building one of the largest Army Corps of Engineer projects in the country. It's the Fargo Flood Diversion. It's a nearly $3 billion project. This was made possible by having multiple levels of government involved in participating in the project. It's not always easy, though. In 2011, through the Missouri, we're a dam-controlled river system, and we had a flood of our capital city in Bismarck on a dam-controlled river system. And if you ask anybody in the communities associated with this, they will say the Army Corps of Engineers spent a little too much time in the spring worrying about the nesting of a piped plover and not necessarily about getting water down the system so we didn't flood our capital city. So my question for Ms. Wallace is, as somebody you've mentioned bringing together local stakeholders and supporting regional efforts, and can you speak to the involvement of the federal government, both good and bad, in resilience planet, and what works well and what possibly needs reform?
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest challenges, is getting everybody to understand each other and in the same room. And one thing we were able to do in 2019, in a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers, we tried a unique way of holding meetings where we went to each community and had them set the agenda instead of us setting the agenda. And we had extraordinary feedback from ag representatives, from people who reside in cities, and conservation interests. And they even said to each other, I'm so glad I met you in person and I can put a face to the issue and understand what you're saying better. And I think that's one major step forward that we can do to drive solutions. Because science can tell us one thing, but it's really going to be up to the people to decide what solutions are best for their community. Challenges, one challenge that I might mention, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, well, we find these great solutions and we want to partner through these great solutions. The Corps does have challenges that states have in executing project partnership agreements. Same things with local communities and nonprofits who want to advance private-public partnerships. And that is because they require the non-federal sponsor to fully indemnify the Corps and assume operations and maintenance as prescribed by the Corps in perpetuity. And under a changing climate, that doesn't make sense. So if we could work with Congress to change that, that would be a really big deal for facilitating private investment along with the federal government.
So we have a school being built in Bismarck in as far north and away from the river as you can possibly be. And we're about, I think, 7 months behind on a Corps of Engineers watershed project. It's 1.5 acres. We can't get our school built because we can't get a federal permit in basically a stubble field. So some of those frustrations exist, and it's not a cost issue. I mean, like I said, when you deal with their engineers and some of these really controversial projects, without the Corps of Engineers involvement, we couldn't get them done. And so we do appreciate them on that end. It's sometimes on the other end. How about NEPA review and environmental review? I mean, we all want to ensure proper environmental protections, but there continue to be problems with the proper roles of federal, state, and local government. Do you have any opinion on that? 19 seconds?
In 19 seconds, I could say that we agree that environmental review is important. As with any process, continuously reviewing them and doing process improvements could always be a benefit to our projects.
And I would just end with, I mean, funding these projects is important, but being able to get them in the ground and get them started in a reasonable amount of time will not only, help our communities, but will also help save money. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Armstrong. Next, we'll go to Rep. Huffman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for once again putting together a really interesting and important hearing. And Mayor Satya Rhodes Conway, I want to thank you for making an important point. We're talking about resiliency and adaptation mainly today. And in all of the different impacts that we tackle, whether it is trying to keep our coral reefs alive or our kelp forests in California, or to manage the wildland-urban interface against the scourge of wildfires, or protecting coastal communities against rising sea levels, we have to innovate, we have to adapt, we have to do all of that. But if we don't tackle decarbonization at the same time, the conditions are going to become so much worse, and eventually we won't be able to adapt and find resiliency. So I think you made that point quite well, and I thank you for doing that. Mayor Garcetti, thanks for bringing up the water side of the resilience and adaptation leadership that you have shown. California water is complicated, and we do hear a lot of misconceptions. No dams have been built since 1979, and we could take folks out to see Diamond Valley Reservoir or Los Vaqueros or Warm Springs Dam in Sonoma. They have been built, and other things have been done. In fact, massive storage has been brought online using our groundwater aquifers and innovating in some of the ways that you discussed. But when you spend an entire century building dams in every single place where it makes any sense, you do hit a point of diminishing returns and redirected impacts. And we're at that point now in California. So if we continue to try to apply that 20th century solution to every challenge, it's not going to get us there. We're going to spend a ton of money and not solve the problem. The things you mentioned, though, are creating resiliency and bringing real wet water to communities to make them more resilient. There's a friendly rivalry, of course, between the Bay Area and Los Angeles. But I have to say, in this respect, you check all the boxes of innovative, sustainable water management in a better way, I think, than many of my Northern California communities. We're playing catch up to your leadership. So thank you for that. And I want to just ask you and the other mayors in the time that I have left about an aspect of this climate crisis that really deserves more attention, and it is the urban heat island effect. Because you're also innovating in that respect, and it has social justice and all sorts of other implications. But talk a little bit about what you're doing in Los Angeles to mitigate that problem. And I'll ask the other mayors the same question.
And I'll try to be really quick. Thank you so much for those words and for the great question and for your leadership. For our most vulnerable populations, Representative, we're combining short-term climate adaptation measures like cool pavement, shade structures, cool pavement where we have lighter asphalts that we're pioneering in Los Angeles. It's about 10 degrees less on the ground and about 2 degrees less in the ambient area, which JPL and NASA is helping us work on. Also putting trees, not just dividing them by council district evenly, but putting them where the heat is the most, where often the poorest communities and the least shade exists. Moving towards shade as an equity issue, as I described earlier, are two of the main ways that we're looking at, as well as, obviously cool rooftops and light rooftops as well being mandated in our building codes.
And for the other mayors, if time allows, I'd love to hear from you.
In Atlanta, in partnership with Spelman College and Georgia Tech, we are studying this and also working on a study that really will confirm what we already know, that our marginalized communities are the ones who are bearing the burden of this. And again, I'll give myself as an example. I live on the southern part of our city, a primarily African-American community. My monthly utility bill rivals small commercial establishments. And that is not unusual. And so it not only is it creating an issue that we literally can feel, but it's also creating an issue that's a burden in our pocketbooks on a monthly basis.
Thank you, Representative. I think in Madison, just really briefly, we are also leaning into the urban forest, but we need building solutions. And frankly, the reason that we're not able to do more in Madison is because in Wisconsin, the building code is controlled at the state level, and we are preempted from exceeding that. I would love to be exploring more solutions around white roofs, different building technology, efficient and sustainable heating and cooling options like heat pumps. But I'm very constrained in what I can do by state preemption.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Rep. Huffman. Next, we'll go to Congressman Crenshaw of Texas. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Important hearing. We're talking about resiliency to weather, and I'm going to focus on flooding because look, we're used to the heat and we're used to floods. So in Houston, but we got to get our facts straight and understanding the problem so that we can arrive at the right solutions. Because oftentimes it rains here, rains a lot here. And then we hear that, well, that's climate change. That's what climate change looks like. But the thing is, and this, I'm not denying climate change, of course, but what we do have to get straight is the rhetoric surrounding it. We are in a humid subtropical climate. We're on the Gulf of Mexico. We have 10 winding waterways. We're historically prone to flooding. This last month, everybody was talking about, it was May, we had 11 inches of rain overall. And it was considered exceptional. It's actually the median. And, I can go back to 1888 and just from that far back, you can find 11 inches of rain for the month. So it does happen. It's not going to change anytime soon. We hear that we've had more 500-year floodplains or 500-year floods in the last decade than ever before. But this is actually a clever distraction from the real point, because the 500-year flood is an insurance term. And that floodplain boundary changes based on urban development. So if we're trying to prove that it's associated with climate change, we'd have to talk about rainfall, and we haven't seen that data yet. I'm not saying we won't. Indications say that we might, and we should reduce carbon emissions as a just in case scenario. Again, we're in agreement on that. But to talk about flooding and resiliency, we do have to focus in on what really causes it, and it's a lack of infrastructure planning, and it's poor development planning that really doesn't take into account the long history of normal rainfall that we have in Houston. So again, it is important to have the discussions on this committee about reducing carbon emissions long-term. There's an agreement in the outcome desired there. I think we have disagreement on what solutions we would prefer. When we talk about resiliency, that conversation just has to happen whether climate change is a factor or not. Because the reality is the rain in Houston isn't going to change much no matter what we do. and we just need to be prepared for it as we have more people. So Ms. Wallace, I want to talk about the barriers that are in place with respect to that development. You don't work in Houston, but you understand the challenges. How long has the Mississippi River Basin been flooding, and how long has the federal government known this is a problem? And have they really devoted the funds necessary to that problem?
We've been watching major flood events happen since at least 2008 was probably a major one that set this course for we need to develop a systemic plan for flood and how floods are conveyed and stored. And in the middle of that, 2012, some other periods, we've seen some pretty consequential droughts. Knowing that the two are intermixed, we want to plan for both and in an integrated way. But to speak to your question about, what are the flow frequency profiles? The Corps of Engineers is working on updating that. Just last year, the Corps of Engineers also updated a two-dimensional model. And actually, it was not updated, it was a new two-dimensional model to provide that tool for planning that you underscore of the importance along the entire Mississippi River. So now we can understand what happens when you put a structure in there, if you add conveyance, and look at the effects all around. And that hopefully will allow our planners in the local communities to build resilience around that and fit that within a system plan. Is that fitting your question?
A little bit. I mean, what I'm getting at is it does seem that we can add funding to this, but there's problems with the way we're modernizing the process by which we actually approve and plan for these projects. How can we do better on that?
That's a great question. Broadly speaking, we work at a full regional scale and then work with our state partners and our local partners, having all hands on deck, having that shared vision leads to an approval process. On the lower Missouri River, for example, after the 2019 flood, there was a community there that the levee district itself worked to expand the river floodplain by doing a levee setback. And that came at a local level, but the state endorsed that, the federal government endorsed that. They knew that they needed to recover somehow. That's a great example that should be highlighted across the country as a way that all levels of government, all the way down to the residents who work there, come up with a solution that takes account just current flooding and what's projected long-term.
Well, I'm out of time. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Rep. Neguse. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing today. And I want to say thank you to each of the witnesses for testifying and for their service to our country and to their respective communities. Nationwide, as we've heard during the course of this hearing, our local communities are struggling to keep up with the challenges of climate change, from extreme weather impacts to natural hazards, such as flooding, as was just previously mentioned, and of course wildfires, which is particularly important for me and for my state. I represent the great state of Colorado, as many of you know, and in 2020, we had a devastating and historic year for wildfires. 3 of the 5 largest fires in state history occurred in the last year, and 2 of those were in my congressional district, the Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Fire. Unfortunately, we can expect to see fires of this magnitude in the coming decades if we don't address climate change in a bold way. And I certainly want to thank the mayors for their work in this regard. Additionally, communities are still building back in Colorado after we saw historic and devastating floods in 2013, which caused over 11,000 people to be evacuated, damaging 19,000 homes and tragically claiming several lives. Local emergency management officials have stressed the need for increased flexibility from FEMA to allow for building back better in the wake of these natural disasters. We have a bill, the Climate Resilient Communities Act, which would help us do so, and we're certainly excited about moving that to the floor. But in my view, the most meaningful pathway towards achieving what I've described is through the establishment of a 21st century civilian climate corps, which, as I know the witnesses are certainly aware, the president has announced his support of. Ultimately, it would ensure that we make bold investments in climate solutions and the workforce needed to implement them. And in particular, for purposes of my state, the work that is necessary in our public lands, wildfire resiliency, mitigation, and so forth. And so I wonder, Mayor Garcetti, as well as Press Mayor Bottoms, if either of you are familiar with the Climate Conservation Corps proposal, and if you might be able to opine or expound a bit on how it might impact your respective communities.
Absolutely. It's a great program, one that I'm incredibly supportive of, and one which I'm not waiting for the feds, though looking forward to federal enacting of this. We've launched an Angelino Corps here, building on something that was the Los Angeles Conservation Corps for a long time. It actually does amazing work because it takes some youth who have faced the toughest environments, coming out of the foster system, being in juvenile halls, et cetera, and turns them into environmental stewards, helps them graduate from high school. They work sometimes past and even through college, as well as other folks who are returning either from the criminal justice system or folks who are just interested in helping out. And so coming out of the pandemic, we're going to be doing hundreds of these. Looks like the state of California will match that and double that. So we might have as many as 1,000 Americans who are in there going door to door and making sure the questions from Republican and Democratic members alike during this session are addressed. Get that energy help to poor Americans in my city. Get folks who can help weatherize homes. Let people know about the rebate programs, et cetera, that's out there, and let them be empowered not to be passive recipients, but active participants in this struggle.
And thank you for the question. I am not familiar with the program, but it does sound extremely interesting. And again, going back to the equity focus that we have from our administration, youth engagement, workforce development training is a huge part of that, especially as we go into the summer months and we are experiencing all the other challenges after COVID related to an uptick in crime, kids being out of school, et cetera. We have a very keen focus on youth development and workforce engagement. So it is something that I am certainly interested in learning more about and would definitely align with what our focus will be over the next several months.
Thank you both. And Mayor Rhodes Conway, if you'd like to add, if you're familiar with the program.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. I am familiar with the proposal and I'm a big fan. We would definitely use it in Madison. We have a similar project that we support through the city, engaging disconnected youth in our conservation parks in particular, which we have increased under my administration. But similarly, we have our Green Power training program here in the city of Madison, where we have we hire trainees and train them on solar installation, LED light conversion, and we're hoping to expand further into some of the green infrastructure work that we're doing, forestry, et cetera. To date, our trainees are 73% people of color and 33% women. These folks can go on to careers in these industries, but what has happened is that we are hiring them into our public works department, diversifying those departments and setting them on the path to a good family supporting job in the long term. I'm very proud of this program. I think every city in the country could do something like this, in addition to state governments and private companies as well. And I really think that we need to be investing in our youth and our workforce in a way that is sustainable and grows these good green job careers.
Thank you. I see my time has expired, but again, thank you to each of the mayors. Very much appreciate your testimony, and in particular to Mayor Bottoms. Thank you as you near the end of your term. We want to say thank you for all the great work you've done down in Atlanta. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Rep. Carter of Georgia. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here, especially the mayors. I was a mayor in another life, and I know what a challenging position it can be, and I appreciate your interest in this. And having said that, I'll start with you, Ms. Wallace, since you're the only non-mayor on the panel. Ms. Wallace, in your testimony, you say, we will benefit from the rich history of multi-jurisdictional cooperation, pulling from the unique strengths of our federal partners and other public and private stakeholders. What are the unique strengths of the federal government that they can bring to governments like yours, or partnerships like yours, I should say?
Thank you for that question. So on the Upper Miss, we were previously, UMRBA was a federal state commission, and we were born from that. And so we had this underlying history since the 1970s of working in a very tight partnership between the federal agencies and the states. Our federal agencies range from the Army Corps of Engineers, which with its engineering of the river system, also its ecological restoration program. We have the Fish and Wildlife Service, which offers its unique role in terms of wildlife management, ecological processes, FEMA with its role on hazard planning and response, as well as US EPA with oil spill response planning and mapping. And then with USGS, their science research arm, NOAA, National Weather Service, with both its integrated drought planning and resources, and then also its forecasting prediction capabilities and understanding of the history of climate in the Upper Miss. So all of that together is fantastic.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. When is the federal government an obstacle or a burden to you?
Sometimes when each agency might have their own perspective for how things go forward, but as within any family, you might have disagreements here or there or challenges for moving forward, but we strive to overcome those. Again, one that I've highlighted earlier is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project partnership agreements. If those could be more shared in terms of their liability, we would have far more and faster, I think more efficient agreements between the Corps and the non-federal sponsors.
Okay. Well, you emphasized in your testimony how different communities are linked and the need for a shared vision for resiliency. And I want to thank you for that, because I agree, and I believe that Representative Palmer was the one who pointed out how important resiliency is. Representing the entire coast of Georgia, I can tell you that we need to build up our resiliency. There's no question about that. And that is not a partisan issue. So it's very important. Thank you, Ms. Wallace. Mayor Bottoms, I wanted to ask you, you've committed Atlanta to 100% renewable clean energy by 2035. And I know that in Los Angeles that they've committed to be 100% by 2045. And en route to that in LA, in Los Angeles, they've had rolling blackouts as a result of depending on renewable energy that has turned out not to be as dependable. And we all understand the concerns of that. Now, excuse me, but as you know, as a Georgian, I'm very proud of what we've done. We're in the top 10 in solar energy. We've got the only nuclear reactor. You'll find this hard to believe, but we're the number one forestry state in the country, and we serve as carbon sinks. But how are you going to achieve this 100% renewable by 2035 and avoid these rolling blackouts?
Well, thank you for the question. We have been very thoughtful in our planning with this. And in fact, we had an earlier deadline to achieve this goal, and we extended the deadline because we wanted to make sure that we were thoughtful. A huge part of that has been working with our utility partners, making sure that Georgia Power has been a part of this discussion, because we want to make sure that as we work to achieve that goal, that it's beneficial for all of our communities. And so if that means that we have to further extend the deadline, which I certainly hope we will not have to do, but if we have to do that to make sure that we get it right, we will certainly do that and continue to have at the table front and center our utility partners to make sure that it's achievable.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Bottoms. And again, thank all of you on the panel for this important discussion. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Madam Chair, could I ask a point of clarification? Would it be possible to just give Mayor Garcetti a few seconds to clarify that there haven't been any rolling blackouts in California because of renewable energy?
Correct. And it's this second congressional hearing where, unfortunately, that mischaracterization. Los Angeles has never had a single rolling blackout. You can speak about California more broadly, Mr. Huffman, but I would just want to establish that for the record. We have not, and we never did because of renewable energy. It's the second time in a congressional hearing that's been put forward, and I very respectfully just want to correct the record.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Next, we are going to go to Rep. Brownlee. I think she's going to come right back. So in the meantime, why don't we go to Rep. Miller. Rep. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves. I just want to thank you all for being here today. And, like many of my colleagues,
Sitting on the committee, my district in West Virginia has been gravely impacted by extreme weather events. And I feel for the Americans who have been impacted by natural disasters. And I look forward to using this hearing and future hearings to learn more about what actions that we can take to create real concrete results to mitigate the damage and save lives. My district in southern West Virginia has a history of flooding. In 2016, 3 schools in one rural county were completely destroyed, which basically by flooding, which it's, the schools are the center of the communities. And so it halted learning, it deprived the residents of the places that, they went for everything. And it's taken years for this to be changed and, the schools to come back up. These catastrophic floods cost 23 lives at that time, and our communities are still in a recovery process. But that isn't, it's history, but it's happening right now. Last night in West Hamlin in Lincoln County, which is in my district, they were hit by severe flooding, and at least 50 families were trapped in their homes, and it damaged many others. And, my prayers go out to these people who are affected in West Hamlin in Lincoln County. But, we need to figure out what to do. And that's why it's so important for us to understand what steps the federal government can take to help create real results. Destroying our American energy infrastructure and instead relying on foreign sources of energy will create more global carbon emissions. We need to do more to shore up our supply chain of critical minerals so we can produce energy of all kinds here in America and create jobs for our constituents. And in the meantime, we've got to prepare our communities to mitigate damage from these extreme weather events and promote policies that prioritize resiliency. Mayor Rhodes Conway, in your testimony, you mentioned the dangers that flooding presents to the city of Madison, Wisconsin. What steps has Madison taken to promote resiliency from flooding? And how do you empower your citizens to engage in pre-disaster mitigation for their homes?
Thank you, Representative. It's an excellent question, and flooding really is an issue. I'd like to point out that Madison, like many other places, really experiences several different types of flooding. So we are between lakes, and so when the lake levels rise over time, and I will say that our lake levels have been rising significantly over time due to increased precipitation, that will cause a backup of our sewer and stormwater system. So there's that problem that we face. There's also the problem of larger rain events. And while we may be getting the same amount of water over time, it is coming in more severe storms so that more of it comes at once. And so then we have both the sort of regular local ponding in our streets and wet basement issues. And then we have the really severe crises like we saw in 2018 with the 1,000-year flood. As to what we're doing, it's again, because we're facing multiple types of flooding, it has to be a multifaceted approach. We are, as I said, studying all of our watersheds to understand where flooding occurs and what improvements we can make in our stormwater system, whether that be about gray infrastructure, pipes, et cetera, or green infrastructure to address these issues. But we also completely revamped our codes, our stormwater code, so that future buildings must be built to accommodate the higher chance of flooding in our community. So that we, when buildings get built from now on, they will be less likely to be impacted by flooding. And one of the major things we did there was that we used to say you just have to pay attention to your own property, which of course means that you can just push the water problem off onto whoever's downhill from you. Now we're requiring folks to take into account the entire system and not push their problems.
I want to ask you one more quick question.
Of course.
Our rural communities often lack the resources available to the larger cities to engage in pre-disaster mitigation, as well as promoting resiliency. As your role as the co-chair of the climate mayors, how do you think we can help empower these neighborhoods, these communities?
Thank you, Representative. Another excellent question. I really believe that there's an opportunity for the federal government to partner with local governments so that we can identify and scale solutions that are working in one place that may work in another place. And I do think that cities are the laboratories of democracy. We are learning things, we are innovating, and we are happy to share that knowledge and spread it. I work closely with my partners, smaller cities in rural areas in Wisconsin, and I think that model is something that could work across the country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Miller. All right, next, let's see, I don't see a couple of members that we're going to try to come back. So Ranking Member Graves, are you prepared for your questions? Good. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you. All the witnesses, mayors, and Ms. Walsh, thank you all very much for your testimony. It was a big help. So I want to ask what I kind of touched on in the opening statement. How look, you could do all sorts of things in order to try and address resilience. What are some of the guiding principles that you're using to try to identify the investments that you're making? Mayor Garcetti?
I think, look, you have to have collaboration. You can't just come with an empty hat in hand to Washington. So demanding local and state participation. But as Representative Miller said, conscious of the differences between communities and the resources folks have. Second, empower everyday people. Third, make it good for everybody's bottom line. So when you do incentives on energy or water conservation, you can reduce consumption as the quickest way and cheapest way to save everybody money, from the construction side to the bill side. And I'd say fourth, too, look at where you can have a multi-benefit of anything you do. Create local jobs for at-risk youth while you're making your resilient city build out and doing something about the climate emergency. Those are the principles that we engage with every single day.
Mayor, thank you. That's helpful. And I'll tell you, there are a number of things that I've been seeing done across the country that I have strong concerns with, because I don't feel like that they're, as you said, you're talking about dual benefits and making sure that it results in a positive cost of benefit. But unfortunately, I've seen a lot of things around the country that don't appear to be doing that. Look, I'm not going to proliferate rumors, but I've read some things that Curry Yoga and Taj Mahal may be in your future, and I don't want to I don't want to cause any problems at all. So feel free, wave me off, or provide it in writing if you'd like in the future. And I mean that. If you look at what's happening, some of the models showing all of this transport, all of this, the additional emissions coming from countries in Asia like China, how does that make you feel that you're there trying to be aggressive, leaning forward? Meanwhile, you've got these extraordinary emissions. And in fact, China just even said this week that they might put the brakes on some of their reductions. Again, feel free to respond in writing later. If you want to. No, I mean that. I do. No,
I appreciate it. And I'm happy to actually answer it because, as chair of C40 cities, these are the 97 mega cities in countries like China, India, across Africa, the Americas, Oceania. And I'll say this, of those 97 cities, 54, I believe, of them have met or exceeded their promises in the Paris Climate Accord. They come from China. They come from countries that haven't met those goals, including our own. There's only 2 countries in the world that have met their pledges, and that's, I think, the Gambia and Morocco. So it's not like we have a lot of countries that are meeting the mark, but cities, I think, are inspiring those nations to do better. It's the citizens of Beijing, when we have those monitors up in the US Embassy, that said our air quality, we now know what it is, and we're empowered to do something about it. I think that's what America can do best around the world, is really empower that grassroots to say to their own national leaders, through their city leaders, let's do better. And that mayor-to-mayor conversation happens beautifully at a global level, too.
Thank you. I'm going to want to follow up with you maybe in writing after this, but I want to turn very quickly. Ms. Wallace, can you talk a little bit, again, I love that Mayor Garcetti quote from in regard to NEPA. It's a great quote and I use it all the time. But Ms. Wallace, can you talk a little bit? I've heard Mr. Congressman Kelly and others talk about frustration with implementation. Can you talk about some of the challenges y'all have had with trying to implement resiliency efforts that are obstructed by some of the red tape? I know Nest and others are priorities of you and your organization.
Yeah, NESP is a priority that we hope to see move forward, both for resilience of the navigation system, but also for the ecosystem. And Like I think what was said earlier, we want to act now so we are prepared and we are resilient going forward into the future. If we delay action, that's really problematic. Our understanding of the delay in NESP is a decision within the Office of Management and Budget not to put it in the budget. And so we understand that the last administration had agreed at the Department of Agriculture level, Corps level, and ultimately it was decided within OMB. And so we're hopeful to get the funding for NESP to move forward. Again, that was an agreement reached by stakeholders, by all the states and the federal agencies and navigation and conservation interests. This is our way forward. It was really insightful and innovative and would answer a lot of our challenges ecologically to the resilience issues.
You. Mayor Rhodes Conway and Mayor Bottoms, I apologize. I do have some questions for you, but I'm out of time. So we'll see if we do a second round, or maybe I'll submit them in writing. Yield back.
Great. Thank you, Rep. Graves. Next, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Thank you again to all of these terrific witnesses. You know, there's so many technological advancements that we can use to help lower electric bills for all of our neighbors. And Mayor Rhodes Conway, you've kind of hit on one of the stumbling blocks, and that's the fact that you're preempted from kind of implementing certain new standards, kind of bringing in some of the modern technology. This is a problem in other states too, where local communities are bound by state laws that prohibit the adoption of modern codes and standards that are proven to reduce pollution and help bring online some of the smart technology. So as we craft legislation in the Congress, how do we address that? How do we, you know, we don't like to take a too heavy of hand. We don't need that kind of national hammer, but we're going to have to help local communities get these things done. How do we do that?
Thank you, Chair Castor. It's an excellent question, and you know, the principle that I would use to guide you here is the principle of floors, not ceilings. That the federal government, state governments should set a minimum requirement and allow subsidiary units of government to exceed that. So for example, if the state of Wisconsin set a floor on our building and energy codes, but allowed jurisdictions like Madison or Green Bay or La Crosse to exceed that, given our local conditions, for example, flooding, I think that it would allow us the flexibility that we need, but not require everybody to hit that higher standard that Madison might want to hit. So I do think that anything that could get states to that principle and philosophy would be extremely important and valuable to us. Failing that, I think, you know, incentivizing states to move towards adoption of the greatest codes. You know, here in Wisconsin, we ignored the last code update. We didn't adopt the national standard. And so we're falling behind every day. Now, thankfully, Governor Evers is taking action to move forward on that. But nonetheless, it leaves us really vulnerable at the local level of not being able to do the things that we need to do to protect our community.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's just such common sense, and we have to use every tool in the toolbox. And it's been good to hear during this hearing that there is bipartisan recognition that the burdens of the climate crisis often fall upon our working class neighbors and our Black and brown neighbors. You know, FEMA is currently seeking help from cities and the public to change the way they address climate threats for underserved communities. But my question to all of our whole panel, what can Congress do now to, you know, now we're marching forward to hammer out the American Jobs Plan. What do we need to include to help your cities center environmental justice across the board, from transportation to water, infrastructure, and housing? What needs to be said and done throughout legislation that we intend to pass? Start with, let's go in the same order. Mayor Garcetti, you can start. Check your audio, Mayor.
My time is limited and it's such a huge question. I would say that the most important thing to do is to make sure that you're demanding some equity measures in there, because you can't fund equity enough. But if you put equity, either has to be, the data has to be collected, or that you have to show the output of hitting all communities, something that I heard across both Democratic and Republican questions today. I think that's a way to make sure that these jobs are local, do local hire for all this infrastructure. Please, please, please allow that and embed that, not just a waiver from the feds on DOT, on water projects, et cetera. And let's create a whole workforce. So this isn't just about doing something for this legislation, but really creating career pathways that will be the climate warriors of this next generation.
Mayor Bottoms, why don't we go to you, and then the others, you can submit answers for the record.
Very quickly, small grant funding to our partners, and also flexibility in funding. I'll just go back a few years to Hurricane Katrina. You think of Atlanta, we are an inland city, not expecting any impact, major impact from hurricanes, but we had to take in a huge amount of the population of New Orleans climate refugees into our city. So these unexpected expenditures that we experience too often now. So any flexibility that we have and expediency in getting funding directly to our cities would be helpful.
I certainly hear that from my mayor here in Tampa as well. Don't park it through the state, get it to the local communities that know how to get things done. You all have been a terrific panel, and I appreciate the involvement of all of our committee members today. Thank you. So without objection, I'm going to enter some documents into the record. Before I do that, I know Congressman Crenshaw brought up some issues on the sources of flooding, the causes. I'll tell you, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they have the most up-to-date scientific analysis on changing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns. I recommend them to you. And in fact, if you go back to the National Climate Assessment, it shows that we're really talking about extremes here. The western and northern parts of the country are warming faster, while places that typically get a lot of rainfall are getting more of it in many of those extreme events. So if folks who may be watching this hearing have questions, go dig into some of those maps, find out what's happening in your location, because the climate crisis is impacting communities across America in different ways. But we know we're paying more, and we're all suffering through many of these extreme events, and we're going to have to become more resilient to them. So without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a June 3rd letter from Water Use Florida, representing water utilities and communities throughout the state of Florida, encouraging Congress to invest in water recycling programs as a part of an infrastructure package to help communities build resilience and mitigate the impacts of climate change. A June 10th letter from the American Society of Civil Engineers, detailing the critical need for investment in our nation's infrastructure, the serious consequences if we fail to act, and the advancements in resilience across all infrastructure sectors that can be achieved by ensuring infrastructure meets modern codes and standards to protect public health and safety. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to please respond promptly. Thank you again. The Select Committee on the Climate Crisis now is adjourned. Have a great weekend.